Greetings and thank you for taking the time to watch my video. My name is Jeff Bonnick, and tonight we are going to review human trafficking in the United States. This is for Professor Green's Law and Ethics class, Business 501 for the fall semester of 2017. So the agenda, what we'll cover, we will define what human trafficking entails. We will overview the current state in the United States. We'll review current laws to combat human trafficking. We'll also mention pending laws that are in Congress at the moment. We'll talk about why some of those laws have not been as effective as desired. And we'll close discussing some of the ethical challenges with capturing human traffickers. So we'll begin with the definition. Human trafficking is a form of modern-day slavery. The crime occurs when a trafficker uses force, fraud, coercion to control another person for the purpose of engaging in commercial sex acts or soliciting labor or services against his or her will. There are three primary types of human trafficking. They include sex trafficking and prostitution, forced labor, in which victims are made to work for little or no pay, often to manufacture or grow products that we consume on a daily basis, or domestic servitude, which is seemingly normal practice of residents having live-in help, be it a maid or butler or something of that type, but they're there against their will, either coerced with threat of deportation or some other forceful way to keep them there. One thing to clarify is human trafficking is often confused with human smuggling. Trafficking is the illegal exploitation of a person, where smuggling is the illegal movement of someone across the border, but they are very different. So, an overview. Every year, millions of men, women, and children are trafficked in countries around the world, including the United States. It's estimated that trafficking generates many billions of dollars, although it's just an estimate because so much of it is unreported or unprosecuted. It's considered the second most lucrative criminal activity behind drug trafficking. Human trafficking is a hidden crime, as victims rarely come forward to seek help because of language barriers, fear of the traffickers, and or fear of law enforcement. Traffickers typically look for people who are susceptible for a variety of reasons. Psychological or emotional vulnerability, economic hardship, lack of a social safety net, natural disasters, or political instability. And the advance of the internet and social networking has certainly benefited traffickers who often establish themselves online as some kind of friend or someone to turn to for people in need, and then they will often try and escalate that friendship to in-person meetings, and then from there it usually the switch gets flipped to having to pay for being there or justify their existence. The trauma caused by traffickers can be so great that many may not identify themselves as victims or ask for help, even in highly public settings where they seemingly have a way out. So for human trafficking laws, there are several on the books, but certainly the cornerstone is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, TVPA of 2000. It was really the first time when human trafficking and related offenses were established as federal crimes and had severe penalties attached to them. It also established methods of prosecuting traffickers, methods of preventing human trafficking. It protects victims and survivors of trafficking. It mandates restitution be paid to victims of trafficking. And it established the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking of Persons. This organization produces a detailed annual report that summarizes the trafficking activity and the effectiveness of uh, countermeasures to reduce trafficking in all the countries across the globe. Countries are rated from Tier 1 being the best to a Tier 3. U.S. has been a Tier 1 since the inception of this report. Finally, the TVPA established the T visa, which allows victims of trafficking and their families to become temporary U.S. residents and permanent residents after 3 years. There have been several updates since the original inception in 2000 to the TVPA. In 2003, it was added the established right for victims to sue traffickers, added human trafficking to racketeering influence corrupt organization statute, meaning that human traffickers could now be treated as organized crime and prosecuted accordingly. It added provisions to protect victims and families from deportation. The next update was in 2005. It established a pilot program to shelter minors who are trafficking survivors. It created a grant to assist state and local law combat trafficking and pay for those operations. It ensured government contracts are not made with organizations that promote trafficking. Next update in 2008 to TVPA implemented new prevention strategies, new systems to gather and report tracking. It expanded the protections available with the T visa. It enhanced criminal sanctions against traffickers. And the last completed update in 2013 enhanced programs to ensure U.S. citizens do not purchase products made by victims of trafficking, either nationally or otherwhere across the globe. It prevents child marriage, and it strengthens the collaboration with state and local law enforcement to ease charging and prosecuting of traffickers. Besides TVPA, there are several other laws on the books to combat trafficking. The Customs and Facilitations and Trade Enforcement Reauthorization Act of 2009 was an amendment to the original Tariff Act, and it was intended to prohibit the importation of goods to the U.S. made by the benefit of human trafficking or forced labor. The Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004 really established the Human Smuggling and Trafficking Center to achieve greater integration and overall effectiveness of countermeasures. The PROTECT Act of 2003 is an acronym for prosecutorial remedies and other tools to end the exploitation of children today. The Civil Asset Forfeiture Reform Act of 2000, CAFRA, this notified property owners that their property or organizations were being used to facilitate the transfer of illegal aliens, often for trafficking purposes. And then the Mann Act of 1910, which made it a felony to knowingly persuade or induce or coerce an individual to travel across state lines to engage in prostitution. Aside from the laws that are in place, there are several that are being considered in Congress right now. Two we've highlighted here. S 1311, Abolish Human Trafficking Act of 2017. This is the newest proposed update to TVPA, and it would establish a human trafficking justice coordinators to increase prosecutions. It has passed through the Senate, is next scheduled to go through the House of Representatives. The next item is S 1532, No Human Trafficking on Our Roads Act. This bill would disqualify from operating a commercial motor vehicle for life any individual who was found using a commercial vehicle to commit a felony involving human trafficking. So despite the number of laws in place, they have been somewhat ineffective. So seemingly contrary to that, in the 9-year period directly after implementing TVPA, 644 defendants were charged with human trafficking violations, which was an increase of almost 700% over the previous 9-year period. However, if you compare that to the estimated 14,000 to 17,000 victims being trafficked in the U.S. each year, the number is really inconsequential. In 2016, there were only 297 trafficking convictions in the United States, and the majority, about 85% of those, are related to sexual trafficking. One of the reasons that the laws are so effective is it's very difficult to identify victims, many of whom would have traditionally been classified as an offender. And certainly the traffickers play this up to their victims and, you know, threaten to call the police on them and report them for being prostitutes to get them deported or locked up. There are also institutional challenges to the enforcement of the newer human trafficking laws. There's certainly a lack of specialization within the law enforcement community to understand how to apply these new laws, lack of training and tools. There's a lack of victim services when victims are identified. There are attitudinal challenges and negative attitudes towards victims and their credibility. So one of the real challenges that prosecutors encounter is really a requirement to prosecute a trafficker is to get the victim to testify. And that is typically challenging to get them to be willing, and then their credibility is always questioned. As you know, in the past, the person participating in prostitute would have been an offender instead of a victim, and defense attorneys will often play up that angle. Along those lines, there are ethical conflicts in identifying the victims of trafficking. Many of those victims suffer from trauma, depression, self-blame, and guilt. Again, they are likely required to testify against trafficker to successfully prosecute, and they are often unwilling to cooperate for fear of retribution. Along these lines of identifying victims, as a healthcare administrator, I found it interesting to learn about how medical professionals have to decide what to do when they identify a potential victim. So, they are charged to determine the patient's rights versus what is right, to determine if it's a helpless victim or an agent with decision-making power. And there is some mandatory reporting for minors. Anytime a minor appears to be injured, they must be reported for child abuse. And for adults, if there are injuries caused by weapons or suspected abuse or suspected domestic abuse, it is mandatory to report. But otherwise, it is not, and it is up to the interpretation of the healthcare professional on whether or not to report this. And intrusive questioning may cause a victim to leave or avoid future care, which violates the healthcare obligation to first do no harm. So as a result, there's often potential victims identified, but who are unable to be brought forward to prosecute the traffickers. And so this problem continues to escalate. So with that, I will conclude my presentation. Thank you again for your time. Have a great night.